What has your desk looked like for the past year? Despite the memes, tweets and videos, it's likely working from home is here to stay. Even after the pandemic, most office employees want to keep doing it at least one day a week. But this brave new world of working is forcing policymakers and employers to wrangle with some unforeseen issues, many of which will have far-reaching effects on workers around the world for decades to come. This is Donna.
How's that?
And this is Donna's office.
Hey! I'm Donna Sarkar, and right now I am in Barbados.
Donna works as a software engineer for Microsoft. Before the pandemic, she rarely worked from home.
When this pandemic set in, I honestly had culture shock. I've never worked a job where I have zero human interaction in my 20 years of tech. So it all started in June of 2020. We'd been now in lockdown since March. We're not going outside. We're not meeting anyone. I see this random article that said Barbados is offering a 1-year remote work visa to foreigners all over the world. And I thought, that's kind of interesting.
3 months later, Donna and her husband said farewell to their home in Seattle and up sticks to Barbados.
Last night we sat out on the boardwalk and had rum punches and tacos and overlooked the ocean, and it was magical. It was a throwback to a time like almost a year ago when you could do that.
Working from paradise was made possible by a special visa which allowed Donna and her husband to continue doing their jobs in Barbados while still paying income tax in America.
When I dial into meetings, people are like, oh, look at you and your beautiful sunny skies outside. And I'm like, yeah, sorry, not sorry at all. Given that in Seattle, it's gloom and doom and dark at 4 o'clock and raining.
But before you start packing your bags for your own overseas adventure, you may want to heed the advice of an employment lawyer.
We're seeing quite a lot of requests coming through from employees to employers to work in other locations. And I think employers need to consider those requests very carefully, depending on the location of where the employee wants to work and their own nationality. There could be immigration or visa issues as to whether or not they're actually entitled to work in that other location. I think they would need to be mindful of some of the benefits that they have as a result of their employment could potentially be voided if they're working abroad. So I'm thinking of things like private medical insurance.
And having employees working abroad could cause a headache for their employer too. Say, for instance, an employee based in Britain decided to relocate to India, but to keep working for their British company. Just by being in India, there's a risk that the Indian authorities would regard the employee as setting up a permanent base for their company, which means their employer might be liable for Indian taxes, and they might have to abide by India's employment laws too. And this question doesn't just arise when crossing national borders.
There are some interesting legal battles now developing across the world, including in the northeastern United States, where Massachusetts and some sort of nearby states are in this kind of interesting battle over whether or not Massachusetts should be allowed to tax people who officially work in Massachusetts, their offices in Massachusetts, but at the moment they're actually doing most, if not all, of their work from where they live, which is outside Massachusetts.
And employers are not only having to consider challenges around where people work, but how they work.
In the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think we saw quite an ad hoc approach to the provision of office equipment to home workers. We saw in the press those photos of people taking their monitor under their arm or even their office chair on the tube. Employers do have a duty of care in relation to providing a safe place of work, and that extends to an employee's home if that is where they are working, because what might have been an okay chair to sit on for a week or two, 6 months down the line, and perhaps isn't suitable.
A work environment, however, is much more than a desk and a laptop, and the experience of working can be deeply unequal. Take two employees of an imaginary company. Sarah is a senior manager and has worked at the company for 20 years. Luke is an entry-level graduate who has been in the job for less than a year. Sarah lives in a big house and has a separate room that can be used as an office. Luke lives with 3 flatmates and works from his bedroom. Sarah has reached the top of her industry. As she no longer has to commute, she gets more time to spend with her family. Luke, meanwhile, is sick of his flatmates. His career would benefit from being around senior colleagues like Sarah.
So when you're at the start of your career, perhaps the biggest thing you want to try and get right is to build your networks, both within your firm and outside your firm. And in a world where there's more working from home, that does become a bit more difficult. It's not really so much of an issue for senior staff because they've kind of already developed their networks. So I think that will probably be the biggest challenge faced by junior employees as we move towards a more hybrid way of working.
More than half of British 18 to 34-year-olds found working from home challenging, compared with less than a third of 55 to 75-year-olds. So how can employers ensure the physical and mental well-being of their employees when they work from home? For inspiration, it might be worth looking to the world leader in remote working. Finland has been at the forefront of flexible working since the 1990s. Even before the pandemic, almost a third of Finns occasionally work from home, including Gersemai Blomqvist.
I got a small electronic desk and I had this large screen before, and I have a good chair, and I have a window now out to the yard or garden and forest. And also this is my yoga studio as well, so it's perfect.
Gersemai is a Finnish professor who's been researching remote working.
In Finland there's a long tradition for remote work. There are several reasons, but one is that we have a good broadband all across the country. And then also I would say that the digitalization at the workplace, so you don't have to take all the papers from work to home, and the high portion of knowledge workers in Finland. And then another thing which I also think is quite important is the culture of trust. And that is something we also see in our research.
Finland even has a specific remote working law which allows employees to work from somewhere other than their office for at least half the week. All this meant that when the pandemic hit, the shift to remote working for many Finns was
surprisingly easy.
By April 2020, Finland had the highest proportion of people working from home of any other EU country. Although many countries already had employment laws on flexibility, working hours, and health and safety, few had specific remote working legislation like Finland. The pandemic has changed that. Around the world, governments are playing catch up, considering laws not just around how many days a week people can work from home, but also what equipment an employer needs to provide, what workers can claim on expenses, and even the division between work and home life. But changing laws is not easy.
Even if legislation was proposed at this stage, with the various readings and consultations that would be required, it would be sometime, likely a couple of years, before we'd actually see it come through. I think the more likely route for the moment is development by individual employers of policies, perhaps further guidance, for example, from Health and Safety Executive on health and safety requirements for working from home. And yes, perhaps in the longer term, specific legislation, but for the moment, I think we're likely working within the framework of what we already have.
For many, perhaps the biggest problem with working from home is the blurred line between work and social life.
Some people, like the commute. to actually get that physical removal from the office and, any issues or stresses that might be associated with that. I think if there were to be legislation, potentially one area could be working hours and that delineation between work and home life.
There's kind of growing concerns, I think, about the question of privacy, the right to have a personal life, and the right to be sort of, for your boss to have some oversight of what you're doing, as they would when you were in an office, but not so much oversight that you feel that you're never able to actually have privacy and personal space. So I think sort of negotiating those boundaries is going to be a kind of quite interesting area over the next few years.
Some countries, like France, already have specific legislation around the right to disconnect. In Finland, legislation on flexible working hours has helped the work-life balance. Geersenmeyer's research found that during the pandemic, 75% of Finns felt they could well balance their work and personal life demands, and 86% were satisfied with working remotely.
People have been very happy for working remotely. They feel that they are very productive, they are highly satisfied for their work, and they have been able to also have a work-life balance.
A survey of British businesses found that more than a third were planning to review their office space requirements after the pandemic. But some companies have already announced that they will be getting rid of the office altogether.
I think it will require a conversation between employer and employee to reach agreement, if possible, as to what the working arrangements will be going forward. And I think that there does need to be a degree of recognition that not everyone's home is sufficiently set up to enable them to comfortably and efficiently work from their home.
So how can remote working be made more equal? One proposal by Deutsche Bank is that those working from home should be taxed 5% more to compensate those who cannot work from home. If the worker was provided with a permanent desk, the tax would be paid by their employer. But if the employee chose to work from home, they'd pay the tax themselves. Some American companies have already announced pay cuts for those who want to work from a different city or state.
I mean, there is another way of looking at this, which is that companies are saving a large amount of money on office space, and in somewhere like San Francisco, those savings can be fairly significant. So there's also, I think, a theoretical argument for saying that when people are working from home, you need to pay them more rather than less. I think really this is a question for the market rather than for the state, and we'll just sort of see how it evolves over time.
Even if companies did insist on a salary cut for remote workers, some may see it as a worthwhile sacrifice to have a different working environment.
I probably would have taken a salary cut to come work in Barbados if it required that, because it's an experience. And one thing we've learned from this entire pandemic period is money cannot buy you experience.
Even after the pandemic, it's likely remote working is going to be here to stay. The switch from the office to home may have been forced to happen overnight, but ironing out the intricacies of this new world of working is going to take many years. You're on mute!
Sorry. I'm Callum Williams, Senior Economics Writer at The Economist. You can read my special report on the future of work by clicking on the link opposite. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.